I was born with severe classical hemophilia in 1956. And severe hemophilia is a bleeding disorder that does not affect external cuts. Those can be treated by pressure and bandages, but takes place when internal joints are stressed and capillaries break, and then the joint fills with blood and bends and becomes paralyzed. And this could happen very quickly in a matter of hours, and then the blood reabsorption takes many weeks. And then as it reabsorbs, your muscles atrophy and your joint is more fragile, so then you are more likely to bleed again. Now this cycle didn't really start until I was 3, 4, or 5 years old. Before that, I had bruising, and my mother was more than once treated with great hostility in stores because this little boy that she was pushing around was covered with bruises, and people jumped to the conclusion that she was beating me. But the joint problems really came about when I started to run around and so forth. And at that time, the treatment was very primitive. There really was no treatment except for infusions of whole plasma in which you might get a tiny amount of the missing protein, factor VIII. So from a very early age, I would be going around a normal day, and something would happen. I would do something, and then jump or run or bump into something, and then an hour or so later, it would become clear that this had triggered a bleeding, and the bleeding could accelerate and become very, very painful. And in those days, that meant a trip to the hospital, and then the systems were that I couldn't be seen by a pediatrician until I'd be seen by a hematologist. Hematologist had to be summoned from somewhere else. Then the hematologist would confirm that I had a problem. Then the pediatrician would then be called in, and then the blood bank would be informed. And so there were hours and hours and hours of delay, which meant every minute that passed, the joint was getting worse. So that system was not very effective, and it reflected the priorities of the administration of the hospital, but didn't reflect the priorities of the care of the patient. And that was not uncommon in the 1950s. Over time, we gradually learned to ask for and to better care, and physicians and institutions gradually provided it. But by the time I was 5, I was in a leg brace on my left leg. My left knee had been pretty much destroyed, and my right leg was experiencing a lot of trouble. So this is important because from the age of 5, I was in a regular elementary school in White Plains, New York, and I was attending school, but I was a disabled child attending a regular school long before the Americans with Disability Act, long before there was much sensitivity to that. And here I had come from what otherwise might be considered a rather privileged part of American life. My parents had gone to college. My mother was the first person in her family to go to college, but my father had come from a line of people who'd gone to college. They were middle class, but well educated. They both went to school on scholarships. So in one sense, we were white, middle class, Protestant, straight family, conventional family. And yet I had all these problems that people found very hard to accept. Other children found hard to accept. My mother had great difficulty persuading children to come over and visit me. Parents did not want me to go to their house lest there be some crisis, medical crisis that they couldn't handle. So it was a life of sort of 1950s, 1960s conventional suburban life, except there was this wall of isolation and fear generated mostly by other people that we had to live with. Now what that did is I was a very passionate extrovert and keenly interested in all the things going on in the world. And my parents were journalists, and they would bring home magazines and books, and I just voraciously read whatever I could find. When the Time Life science series came out, I read everything, and I hardly know what would have happened to me if I'd had access to the internet then, because I was this hungry, hungry mind. searching for things. But I also came to realize that I was not the only person in American society who is experiencing exclusion. And so one of the things for me is, although in some sense, especially when I was, just standing there looking normal, I looked like, as I said, one of the most normal, accepted, normative American males, right? But the way I was treated made me identify much more with other people who had disabilities, or with people who were discriminated for race, or even for class, or for other things, including actually gender issues, because my mother at the same time was trying to help support our family by continuing her work as a writer for Time Life magazine and Time Life books. And she was not allowed to be a writer or to do any of the things. Those jobs were always given to men. My father was a writer. My mother was classified as a researcher. So from a very early age, I became aware that there were all kinds of barriers, to me, artificial, meaningless barriers that were created because people did not know how to take the time to understand the humanity of someone who was different. And that shaped me tremendously in the years that followed. In some ways, I was a very conventional kid. I think I might have been even more prone than most, a little bit more anyway, to hero worship. I loved Roy Rogers, who was my great hero when I was 4 and 5. I worshipped the astronaut in the early astronaut program. I knew everyone's name. I knew all the names of the machines that they rode in and touched. I formed enthusiasms and crushes for TV personalities, and I also began to imagine, partly because my parents were so encouraging. They'd say, you are not defined by this. This is something you're struggling with, but this is not who you are. And so you are going to have a bright and interesting future, and this is a hard time, but we're going to get through it. You're going to get through it, and we're going to get through it. Sometimes that seemed like dreaming, but we all held on to that. I did spend a lot of time in the company of adults, and I appreciated that because, again, I was extroverted. And I think I learned to talk like an adult earlier than most. So in that sense, I think I could articulate some things that other children would have more difficulty with, but I don't want to overemphasize that. The flip side of this is that hemophilia and these problems were normal. I'd never known anything else. So they were so normal to me that I couldn't quite understand why they weren't normal to somebody else. I mean, yes, I couldn't walk, or yes, I had to go off in the middle of the night to the hospital, but what else? What did other people do? I didn't really know. So, but as I got older and as I got into high school and even especially in college, this notion that I was kind of a bridged person, that is, someone who had access to a certain kind of world, but I was also a member, maybe an inclusive, somewhat elite world. I mean, we weren't rich, so there's no, we lived in a tiny little house, but just the sense that we were part of normative American society, but also had this bridge into this invisible American society. The invisible society behind the hospital walls, or the invisible society of any group. So that became stronger, and I think it contributed to my very passionate sense, which came about in early time, for social justice. And that just got stronger and stronger, and eventually shaped my whole life choice. When terrible things happen, as they do to so many people, there's kind of a choice that needs to be made by the person to whom the terrible thing has happened. You may feel in the first round of coping with the experience a horrible sense of unfairness and anger and rage, all of which are appropriate. But there comes a point where if you dwell on that, if that becomes your life definition, that what ends up happening is you say, no one can ever understand me because what I went through is unique. And in fact, what's really terrible is what I went through is so terrible that I deserve more credit in some moral sense than someone else. And this becomes a very subtle and initially legitimate form of victimhood that can become a life defining role. And if you then go down that path, then all you're going to do is spend your life telling yourself that what you went through is worse than when someone else went through, or maybe the people like you who went through your thing are better than people who went through other things. So it is a psychological, moral, spiritual position that continues to shrink your view of who you can be connected to. There's a completely different pathway. And that is to say, it is through my unique pain, my unique suffering, that I have a doorway, a bridge into someone else's unique suffering. I can never understand. For example, we talked briefly. I can never understand the trauma of a mother dealing with an ill child. But I've had moments of desperation and depression. I've had my own children. I've been through tremendous physical suffering. And so somehow those components of my life give me, almost in biological term, connectors to which I can connect to other people. And what that has made me, and God knows not all the time, but it has made me a person, a much less judgmental person, a person who knows that we all suffer. And I am not interested in judging people for the pain they've been through, or the very last thing I want to do is say somehow what I went through is better or more worthy or whatever. And sometimes people say, well, I've been through this, but it's nothing like you went through. And I just want to say, please don't say that. It's not a competition. This is the thing that can enable us to bond beyond all the superficiality that is normally imposed on us. So that's and that's really formed a part of my life. And then when you add to that all the other things that we may talk about in a moment, the sense of brevity of life, I have almost no interest in responding to people in a superficial way. I mean, I've lived a certain kind of life, and it's actually a huge privilege that people tend, like in settings like this, to know a little bit about it. So what they do is instantly offer me some piece of their own real humanity. One reason it took me a long time to sign books is because people came up and they said, thank you for so much for your talk, and I'd like you to sign this book for my son or my daughter or for me. And I'd say, tell me about your son, and out came a story, a painful story. And so that's a very important moment of human connection, even if it only lasts 2 minutes. And it allows me to write a little something that might be relevant to the thing. Now, I think that's the way much of life should be. Fewer walls and more sincerity. There are two kinds of reality floating around. I mean, who knows, maybe thousands, but just for our purposes, there's a superficial reality, which we are constantly talking about or being presented with. And that reality, it is claimed that reality is how life is. And what I mean by that is the reality that says that how much money you have is important, what you wear is important, who you know is important, what your job is important, what are all the things that try to persuade you that you are a better or worse person according to some external judgment. Below that surface is an inner reality, and I would argue a much truer one, where we are each individual children of God put here for a brief amount of time with the special opportunity to enjoy life and to share what we can with each other. And that all that stuff on the top, as fun as it can be, I mean, I'm into some of that too. But real wisdom and real compassion must take you down below that. And so, as a father of 3 children, what I've always hoped, and I feel very fortunate that my children seem to, you can't force them to, but they seem to have picked up on this, that as much as you might be tempted to be involved with this superficial world, and as fun and dazzling and fireworks and all that as it can be, in the end, real meaning, real commitment, real love, real depth, real peace come from connecting with this other world, which is there at every second to be claimed. But you have to be willing to step back from the dazzle and say, what's really happening here? How is a complicated question. I think how parents raise their children, how we expose them to things on television, how we run professional meetings. This opportunity for people to share at somewhat greater depth their story, or the opportunity to raise the kinds of questions that came up today, that's an important part of how. I think learning to not be caught, actually training yourself not to be caught up in the illusion. And my own experience is that I am most transformed by people that I see, who I admire, who I say, my gosh, they seem to be free. Or they're living a life that I don't think anybody can get completely free from it, but that is a life that is of joy, value, purpose, and sure, they may want to go to some, to be part of the dazzle of the world, but they're living a life of real commitment. And I sense that there's so many people here, who've chosen professions and who are doing it because they understand that there are real lives and real emotions and real health conditions at stake. So that's, I'm very interested in politics, but what I despair about right now is that the politics of the United States are being conducted entirely at the superficial level, with no reference to actually the lived experience of, virtually 100% of Americans. And so you have a discussion about the future and about what's important that either appeals to the lowest impulses and fears or simply doesn't address anything else. So that's, I think, when you say the how, part of it is how can we support leaders in whatever institution to stop bullshitting us, which is, excuse me. So one of the things I don't really understand about myself, but I really value about myself, is that at some level I've remained kind of primitive in my moral sense. So what I mean by that is when I was 16 years old, I was invited to see a film. I was living in Paris at the time, just before I turned 16. And I visited a American woman and her French husband who were showing a film about South Africa. And he was making a film of footage that had been illegally smuggled out, and it was about the apartheid system. And I watched this movie about a very highly developed, industrialized, and brutal system of racism in which 10 million people controlled 40 million people, every aspect of their lives, where they lived, where they worked, what they ate, everything. And I also discovered that American companies were very heavily invested in that, which was a secondary piece. But I just couldn't understand, at a very, one might say, very naive way, how there could be a system in, at that time, the 1970s, where racial discrimination, I knew racial discrimination existed everywhere and racial hatred, but this was a full-fledged system passed by laws, enforced by police. And so I basically said, how can this possibly exist? And I spent the next almost 20 years, maybe 18 years, trying to answer that one question. How did this happen? And then also, what could be done about it? And I ended up going to South Africa and meeting hundreds of people and doing research in libraries and going to the bottom of a gold mine. And all of this was to search for the answer. But the answer is a very simple one. The question was a very simple one. How could human beings treat each other in such a brutal way? Now, when I look around the country today, I seem to be pig-headed because I don't understand how we treat each other today. I just don't understand it. How we can say, sure, it's fine if X number of children don't have enough to eat, or it's fine if people don't really have a place to live, or it's fine if so many people are starving or living permanently. Oh, and not getting health care, no big deal, you know. I mean, as somebody who would have died without health care and certainly suffered in those moments when health care was inadequate, this kind of blasé thinking is just fundamentally alien to me. And so, I tend to ask questions not about what's the incremental thing we could do. You know, gosh, we've got this hospital and we could add another 10 patients, which is an important question. But what would it take so that every person in the city had adequate medical care? Or every person in the state, or every person in the country? It infuriated me, and I used to talk about this, that our American health insurance system, which still has many problems in it, but you know, up to a few years ago, the basic principle at work is that the best health care at the lowest cost went to the people who least needed it. The healthier you were, the cheaper your health care, and the better it was. Whereas people who are sick, ill, poor, well, I'm sorry. And to have a system that actually awarded the best to the people who didn't need it and gave nothing to those, that seemed corrupt and stupid. So having reached my age and having apparently not lost this trait, I see this all over the world now. I see. So what I've been able to do, and I've been very fortunate, you know, on this very specific thing like corporations trying to measure whether they have an impact on hiring and energy and environment. I went around and asked people, what do you want to see happen? They said, well, like a little improvement here. I said, well, what would fix the problem? And they said, well, what would fix the problem is if we all agreed to a standard of how to measure this stuff. And I said, well, why can't we do that? And they said, because nobody will be an honest broker for that. And I said, well, what if we were the honest broker for that? And they said, well, that'll never work. And I said, well, what if I tried? And so kind of just going for the big solution sometimes turns out to generate so much enthusiasm that you get there, whereas just kind of being tired and cynical that you can only get to the little thing actually defeats the purpose. So that's kind of the lesson I've drawn. So now I tend to say, you know, what's the big goal, and can we work our way backwards from that instead of what's a little goal that might get us a little further, but just even trying it is kind of depressing. One thing our culture does is, there's many ways in which it helps this, but there are some ways in which it also hurts this, which is giving people a sense of agency. You can make a change. And most of our culture says, no, you really can't. The problems are too big. You don't have enough training. Everybody will laugh at you. People will oppose you. You'd actually be more useful if you did this. It really doesn't help to speak up. Maybe you should wait until you're more important and then you can do something. There's 100 million excuses that deprive people of agency. And that's a great loss in any society, and it's a particular loss in a democratic society, which depends on average citizens feeling that they have the right to act. But in a consumer society, we're supposed to be passive consumers. And in a corrupted political society, we're supposed to be voters even though we're being told our vote doesn't really matter. And in so many ways, we're being told, listen, the best thing for you is to sit here and be quiet and do what you're told. And so I rejoice every time somebody says, well, that's not my way of doing things. I'm going to step out and I'm going to defy all of the ways in which the society has told me I may not do this. And it's different from every person. You know, for my daughter's receiving tons of messages about how, you know, really on balance, you shouldn't do this. Now, fortunately, she's getting a lot more than my sisters or my mother ever got, that she can do it. But there's still plenty of things that say, you're a girl. Yeah, girls don't really. And that outrages me. And plenty of people of color. Yeah, sure, you might think about making some little change, but don't dream big. That's not realistic. I hate several words. One is reasonable, realistic. Those are words that are designed to cut at your dream and ambition. And I also think they're often wrong. People are so consistently wrong that what's reasonable and realistic changes all the time. So I think, and one reason I take this personally is I could, to go back also to what we were talking earlier, I could have spent my whole life saying, I got hemophilia, it really messed up my life. Then I got HIV, and it really messed up my life. And it's all because of these bad companies that did bad things to me. And then I got HCV, and that really messed up my life. And I can't do all these things that everyone else can do. I can't ski. I can't play basketball. I can't, I could be focused on what I can't do and how others put me in the position of not being able to do those things. And so my life is defined by loss and by betrayal of some kind. But and again, how you move away from that? That was actually the thing I wanted to say before. People have asked me, how are you not full of anger? Or how are you not full of grief? Well, I suppose if I did deep psychotherapy, we could dig up some grief, but that's not how I live my life. I think whatever one needs to do so that you reposition away from that victimization, away from that grief, away from that anger, and I think part of it for me was a sense of agency. That despite all these things, I still could act. I could create change. I could draw people to me, or I could reach out to them. That we could overcome problems that seemed insoluble, and that was possible despite all the baggage that you've come through. And I wish we taught that in schools, in colleges. We teach a great deal of passivity in our system. And that's why, oddly enough, even though I have some suspicions about the way or some reservations, but those schools that are now teaching, let's say in a business context, something called entrepreneurship or social enterprise, they're teaching young people, if you have an idea, why don't you try and do it? And I wish we taught that all the way across. My wife is an architect, which is out of the design professions. The design professions say, what is the problem? What are the parameters? How much money do we have? What's the space it has to fit into? And now let's fix it. Let's design it within those things. So that's a whole way of living that I think we should encourage. A great insight that I actually got from Professor Cass Sunstein over at Harvard, who I've never met. But in the 80s, I read a piece by him, and the conclusion of the piece electrified me, because he said, and it seems like a simple idea, but it wasn't at the time, is that people can agree to do the same thing for different reasons. People can have different interests, but still want the same outcome. Now, somebody who's trained in theology and moral philosophy, where you're usually taught, let's get everybody to agree on the same values, and then all the actions will flow from that, the idea that people could have very different values or goals or interests and still agree on the same outcome was a revelation. And so what I realized in the particular case of the Global Reporting Initiative was that there were a lot of people who wanted to see this particular mechanism come into being for different reasons. So I didn't have to waste time saying, you, Madam Corporate Executive, you need to agree with the reasons that are motivating the activist or the investor. Your reasons are good enough, and we need to work on this together. That's one thing. The second thing is the way we dealt with criticism. So in the early days of this, and I actually write about this briefly in the Song in the Night book, people would come to me and say, this is going to fail. You know this is going to fail, and it's going to be a mess. I don't even know why you tried it, because the whole thing was stupid. And I would say, you're right. It's probably going to fail. But with the expertise that you have, it would be so much less likely to fail if you were involved. And they said, I said, that's okay, that's all right. Look, what I'd like to ask you to do is, we're down on the field trying to sort this out. And what I'd like you to do is stay in the bleachers, keep a close eye on us, keep a close eye on me. Here's my email. If you see anything I'm doing wrong, I want you to tell me. And if you ever feel like coming down on the field, working group or something like that, we'll find a place for you because I need your advice. And so people would go away grumbling, but 3 months later, 6 months later, I get a call saying, I've been thinking about this and it seems to be going a little better than I thought, and I'd really like to be involved in the question of assurance, kind of a technical question. I said, well, my gosh, I got 15 people in the insurance. I'm looking for 4 more. Would you like to join? And I saw dramatic transformation. Because the key was once people moved off, cynicism is such a terrible loss of energy and talent. But once they began to move away from that and they became engaged with it, then very often it became the most interesting thing going on in their lives. And so they were sacrificing time, energy. It was actually amusing. It got to the point where people were competing to host us. Like, I want you, and come to my building because I want my boss and you got to come here. So we were invited all over the world. We never had to pay a dime to meet anywhere. But it was a process of, meeting people where they are. I didn't say you're wrong. I said you're right. But here's what would really help. Now, a couple of people, still think I was an idiot. But that's a way of changing the dynamic. I'm just finishing up a very short book written at the request of the Dean of Yale Divinity School on faith and money. And the first chapter is faith and money at the individual level, and the second is faith and money at the community level, and then the third one is faith and money at the system level. And it's designed to be in the domain of practical wisdom, not theory, but about offering perspectives, kind of like we've been talking about. We build structures that are supposed to serve human needs. Sometimes those structures take control and begin to do damage to human beings. And we have to remember that when that happens, it's not the fault of the human beings, it's the fault of the structure. And I take some strength from and guidance from when Jesus talked about the Sabbath. The Sabbath, obviously, a time when there's supposed to be peace and quiet and people not working. But Jesus chose to heal several people on the Sabbath, and he was attacked on the religious technicality that he had done work on the Sabbath. And his response was, essentially, you're getting this backwards. The Sabbath is here for humanity, not humanity for the Sabbath. Now, I take that kind of thinking into our modern economy. Our modern economy is enormously powerful. The systems of exchange, the mechanisms to create capital, the enormous range of products. I mean, I wouldn't be here if it weren't for all the medical equipment and medical pharmaceuticals that were developed. I understand that. What we see, however, is sometimes the market can take control and start justifying behaviors that destroy huge portions of the planet, digging up coal we don't need, pumping oil we don't need, seeking natural gas at a moment when the whole planet is suffering from climate change, or doing great damage through vast global supply chains to people who have to work for pennies on the dollar in very unsafe conditions. At that point, what we're seeing is a market that has run amok. It's simply no longer being constrained by human wisdom and human morality. It can be brought back into being an effective servant of human benefit. The problem is when it, in either an individual life or in a community life, when finance starts to become the master. When finance starts to become the master, a lot of bad stuff can happen. And yet people are willing to do that, to permit that sometimes, because they say, well, this is what happens when you have a free market. Well, markets are excellent up until the moment they start destroying things, and then they need to be constrained. And that's as old as economics, and it's as true today as it was 100 years ago. When I was at Harvard, as part of completing my doctorate, I was invited to become part of the first program in ethics and the professions, which was started by President Derek Bok back in the late 1980s. And what this did was it took a minister in business school like me, or a doctor who was a lawyer, or people who had crossover training, put them in a small class, and we did a year's worth of moral philosophy under an extraordinary philosopher, political philosopher named Dennis Thompson. Anyway, I ran into this problem because moral philosophy obviously strives to be completely secular, but as a result, it spends some time. It's not just that it's secular, it's that at least the time that I was studying, it was hyper-rational. And it was before behavioral economics or psychology had begun really entering into the discussion of human decision-making. So philosophy was trying to mimic a certain form of mathematical economics and painting people as hyper-rational. And they also presented a portrait of human desire, which was essentially self-centered. So it was the utility model, the early 19th century utilitarian model. And so they spent, my colleagues and many of the readings we did, spent an enormous amount of time trying to come up with a definition or rationale for altruism, for being willing to help others, that was rooted in self-interest. That was kind of the alchemy. You know, we start with straw and we end up with gold. And I said, you don't have to do all this work. If you know something about the anthropology of real human beings, they are hardwired to want to help each other and to cooperate in many settings. And you don't have to do this crazy Rube Goldberg system to end up with people care. So that's an example of, you know, because if you keep defaulting back to the strict forms of moral philosophy, then you have to come up with a mathematical justification why people love each other, and that's just a dead end as far as I'm concerned. That's not to say that I think there's tremendous value in having these discussions among people from different disciplines, because you have to level up. You have to find a way to communicate. You have to talk about what's important, and you have to explore those ever-changing boundaries of consent and of the meaning of life and the value of life and the end of life and all those things. And the irony is, you know better than anyone, people start with thinking, well, these answers to these are just self-evident. I grew up with this, and I think this about end of life, and everybody ought to. And they go in, they find somebody who's very, very different. So I think these discussions are essential, but you have to be very careful when you're starting systematically to exclude a portion of human experience or a portion of human personality that we know you can observe in every human being, and yet somehow it's not allowed for our discussion because it somehow treads into a zone that is not okay. You know, if I lived in the South and the Midwest, the fact that I was a minister would be no big deal. The fact that I live in hyper-rational Cambridge, Massachusetts, people sort of go, you're so smart, how could you really be religious? And I say, well, listen, if you have time, I'll explain where my views are. But there's just this assumption, a bias. There's a bias that people of religious faith must somehow have lost an intellectual screw somewhere along the way, and I don't believe that. But anyway. The old days of simply assuming that everyone had the same values or meant the same things by the same words, those assumptions were wrong in many cases, and we now need to acquire much more sensitivity to the way in which people express their obligations and their affections, and that's a good thing. On the other hand, I think it's absurd to throw the baby out with the bathwater, so to speak, and by trying to find a common language, sort of reaching the conclusion that there is no common language and that you're simply surviving in these completely independent moral contexts. I think empirically that's just wrong. People smile at the same stuff. They love their children pretty much in the same way. The Pope, when he was here, did something very interesting. So the Pope, in his white robes representing 1 billion Catholics who have a very highly developed theology, what does he say to the United States Congress, he says the essence of how we should treat each other is the golden rule. Treat others the way we want ourselves to be treated. That's a really interesting combination of, as it would say in Christianity, all the law and the prophets, with a very logical sense of parity, which is embraced by virtually every other religious tradition in the world. In fact, I'm not familiar with one that does not embrace that. So you can, a little bit, it's half empty, half full, but I think there's more than enough to justify not only hope, but the implementation of certain common human values that need to be protected. And we see this in the way strangers protect the life of other strangers in a horrible situation like took place in Paris. We see it where, again, I say human beings are hardwired for generosity. You know, someone comes in. It actually takes a lot to strip out and induce enough fear in us that we no longer are willing to share or no longer are willing to help. And some people benefit by creating that fear. And so we have to live with it. But I am someone who has relentlessly benefited from exactly the opposite thing, where people have knocked themselves out for no conceivable monetary reason to take care of me, people I had no blood relation to, who I might never see again, and who rescued me from one situation after another, including EMTs who picked me up off the ground and brought me and did everything they could, because that was their duty and that was their desire. And there's nothing cynical about that. In writing about money, attitudes towards money vary a great deal around the world, and I just got a book that was written about differences among African cultures toward money. So, for example, thing I happened to read last night, Westerners might say you should save money and stand on your own 2 feet and develop your own money, whereas African culture might say we're all bound together, and one reason we show that we're bound together is everybody owes somebody a little bit of money, and that if you decide to pay off the loan, let's say I owe you a little bit of money, and I come to say to you, you know what, here's your money. That's cutting off a relationship. It's saying, I don't want to be in relationship with you anymore. I don't need you. I'm independent. I'm standing on my own 2 feet. So the same action is read. Now, interestingly, the goal is sort of the same thing, which is to build a healthy, mutually supportive community. But we've adopted the mechanism that we should detach and therefore we have this fetish, but no one ever talks about money, right? And of course, this person's an anthropologist, but he's generalizing quite a bit. But there's a system of, no, well, we talk about it and everybody knows a bit of it, and the whole domain of how you express your generosity is different. The generosity is still the same thing, but the way you express it is different. So in general, I think these kinds of discussions are important because people, I come from the class and background of people who just assumed that everybody thought like, white men, and if they didn't, they were wrong. And I think it's incredibly great to move away from that. But I don't want to go so far as we say there's nothing that binds us as a species, because there's a huge amount that does bind us as a species. And we have obligations that do extend, and much of the danger and damage in humanity is when we successfully conclude, you are nothing to me. When we dehumanize another group to the point we are so different, you are nothing to me, I can exterminate you, it means nothing to me. And that's happened in American history and in global history. So yes, recalibrate and deepen the understanding, no to a fundamental fracture. I have learned that people respond to my story with their stories. They thank me in a way that I don't fully understand, but they thank me for my courage in sharing my story, which I don't feel took any courage. But I appreciate that what they're saying is this must have been difficult, and what I hear in that is it would be difficult for me. And then they start to share their story, and that's very powerful, even in a little bit. And maybe it encourages them to think about that. The other thing is that stories, the concept of narrative fixing everything is true in almost every field right now, in politics and organizing and so forth. But one of the things that stories do is that our analysis tends to break things down into components that we look at. So, the double-blind study will answer a particularly narrow kind of question, and maybe it can be reintegrated. But we live integrated lives that don't always make sense the way we might like them to, but our lives are rich and contextual and incompatible and confusing and broken. And if we care about treating and interacting with real people, we have to have a real sense of what real people are like. And so introducing stories to ethics can introduce some of the complexity that it's just not cut and dried. I often feel, and as I've gotten older, I often feel that somebody will say something to me, and this is partly my training over the years now, and I'm thinking, but why are they saying this to me? What is it? Where did this opinion come from? Where did they get the information? What's driving the animus or the passion or whatever? And if I can get behind that story, I am likely to be much more sympathetic. Even if I don't agree with what they're saying, I'm much more sympathetic. I understand how this was formed in you. And the other thing is that I think, having been a teacher and a preacher and a political person and so forth, that people remember stories. We are a species that remembers, and we repeat stories. And when a story is a puzzling story, we repeat it all the more. So this is one reason why my favorite parable is the parable of the workers in the vineyard, where they are all in the market, and the master goes out and hires some early, and then some in the middle of the day, and some at the end of the day. And the people in the market who get hired are getting more and more depressed as they see people going off to get work, and they're going to be stuck making nothing. Finally, they all go out to the field, and then the master pays them all the same amount. And the people who've been working all day, they're the ones who suddenly feel they've been ripped off. And the reason I love this story is that when you present it to most people, they line up with those who feel ripped off. But when you probe that story for a little while, it's more deeply about how do people respond to generosity. In other words, if you witness someone else being generous to someone else, are you pleased for the person who received the generosity, or frustrated that you weren't the recipient of that generosity? And that reveals an inner human dynamic that gets us to learn something about ourselves. And I think that that's an example of a story that cannot be calculated away or structured through some game theory mechanism. It's a story that reveals the interesting ambivalence of human beings towards when good things happen to other people. So in that sense, I don't believe stories necessarily solve all problems, but they're one technique for backing people off their certainty. I guess that's what I would say. And that's often one of the most important tasks. I decided at an early age that I needed to be very completely open about my hemophilia, because people were, as I mentioned, scared of it. And sometimes someone would muster the ability to say, "What's wrong with you?" And you can hear that question as an assault, but you could also hear the question of, "I really don't know. I mean, So I always took that question as, basically, if you want to know, I will explain it. I'll take the time. And I found that process of engaging a person right at that moment, which could become a moment of hostility or a moment of engagement, resolved many, many things. Many things. So as these other things came along, I was tempted to do it the same way. But with the panic that fled across the United States, admitting that I had HIV suddenly was very scary. And one of the reasons my first marriage broke down was because I I decided to be much more open about my HIV. And my first wife was from the South, and where there was much more discrimination. And her parents were very nervous, understandably. And so she would would have preferred that I really not mention it at all. And instead, I took an increasingly public stand on it, just saying, yes, I'm one of them too, which seemed a form of solidarity for me. But I remember one of the most painful moments was I was teaching at Harvard Divinity School, and they did a story about me having HIV, and we were about to get an au pair to take care of our small children, and the au pair company read about this and pulled the au pair. And then my first wife, who was a full-time professor herself, said, in essence, your openness and courage or foolishness or whatever has destroyed this system of support within our house. And we ended up getting through a whole lawsuit with the thing, and, you know, very, very difficult. But that was an example, you know, smaller than having your house burned down, but that was an example where it reverberated back through a family system, triggered an act of corporate discrimination, and was very damaging to us for a year or so. And so there are times when, you know, I wonder, well, you know, when you write a memoir, one of the things that they tell you is not all stories need to be told. And so when you write something, you're saying, well, which one am I choosing to put out, and which one should I maybe hang on to? And so, yeah, you wonder sometimes if you're picking the right mix. I've noticed, having worked with people from the millennial generation, having children some children who are part of it, and a daughter who is younger than, that part of this profusion of identities and ideas can mean a hesitancy to commit to something that seems like it might confine your evolving identity. So, for example, among religious communities, people feel like, I don't know what I believe yet, or I know a little of what I believe, and I don't want to join something where there's a whole list of stuff that I have to believe before I can become part of this community. Now, that's often an error, the idea that you have to absorb everything, but people feel that way. And similarly, political parties are fading because people feel like there's so much to believe in the world. Why would I affiliate with a group of people who seem to hold a very inflexible set of views and are always sure they're right? And so, in a weird way, that autonomy is undermining institutions of common behavior or common belief that have been a backbone of society for a long time. We'll see what comes of that. To me, it seems a little alarming, but that's because of I grew up in a time when I looked around at the different institutions and I decided which were the ones on balance I wanted to affiliate with. And I didn't think of myself as continuously inventing a new way of living just all by myself. But I think that there's a danger of maintaining a fluid identity for too long because you're somehow afraid that attachment and commitment will cause you to be embarrassed or make a mistake or to violate some inner sense of integrity that you're trying to maintain. Part of the risk of growing up is that you have to make commitments to people, to things, to directions, you can't hold back forever. And so this is going back to the sense of each person having to take seriously the idea of finding a path. And there seems to be a little too much, from my old person's, a little too much passivity. The path will find me. But so, again, to fall into religious language, this is where I think you need a practice. And in talking about faith and money, I talk about gifts of grace or practices that help you zero in on what you want to do, or who you want to be. And one is pursuing simplicity trying to bring as much simplicity to your life as you can. Second, balance, trying to bring balance to your life, whether it is in time or money, so that you're not way over here or way over there. The third thing is what I've already spoken about, wisdom, the ability to see past the illusion presented to you by a person or the illusion presented to you by a product that's being marketed. And the last one is generosity, that when people are made to feel uncomfortable because they don't have enough, and therefore made to feel that we live not in a life of abundance, but a life of scarcity. The antidote to that, oddly enough, counterintuitively, is to give things away. And the more you give away, the more you realize you do have plenty, and that you live a life of abundance, and that all the people who are self-interested in making you terrified that you don't have enough are not seeking the good for you. They're pursuing another agenda. So I'm not quite sure I answered your question, but the sense of helping people to engage in a process in which they locate their authentic selves in this complicated, swirling, noisy life, that's a huge task. In some ways, it's easier than ever before because you can scan and find stuff, and it's almost like the dating apps where you just switch. Buddhism, no. Catholicism, no. This, that, no. But it's harder because there's so many options. But I think that, I've worked with a lot of younger people, and what is remarkable is they seem to contain at the heart of themselves the desire that their lives should be lived with meaning and direction, and that they're not willing to sacrifice a lot of other things. They want to make sure they maintain meaning and direction. And that may be the salvation of our world. I certainly hope so. I believe that institutions, because they are so powerful, can become infected with assumptions and goals that, however unintentionally, can become very damaging. And I saw that in the story I told about the pharmaceutical companies who lost track of who they were really serving. And therefore, I believe that having a formal mechanism to pause and to say, no matter how good this might look, what are we really thinking about? What are we really saying? What are we really asking? What would be the real outcomes? What evidence can we marshal from before? What risks could we anticipate that maybe weren't thought about in a first pass? That is a societal innovation from my perspective. I gather that this, it certainly wasn't around in the 1970s. I think it was just getting started then. So the idea that now not only there are these institutions, but that people are sharing knowledge and best practice in order to deepen their practice and strengthen their knowledge, this is a sign of the maturing of a society. Because our society is dangerously close to adopting technologies without any serious awareness of what the moral or political implications of those technologies might be. Let me tell you a brief story about that. When I was at Harvard Business School in the late 1980s, I was writing business school cases, and I went to write a case about a company that was examining a technique now well known called the restricted length fragment polymorphism. It was about how you break up and cut and splice different gene sequences. And they were working on topics, and I went to talk to the boss, the CEO, and who's a doctor, and I asked him what kinds of things would they work on. And he said, well, we work on this, we work on that. And then I went and talked to the scientists who are actually splicing things, and I said, well, what would you be willing to work on? Would you be willing to redo the gene of a human being, or cut and splice, or and that might be really interesting. And then I said, what about tobacco? Would you ever work on tobacco to improve tobacco? So was more potent or something like that. And they said, oh, no, 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 we hate smoking. Joe and I, neither of us smokes. We would never do that. And I was really struck by the anomaly that these guys, perfectly good guys, were willing to work on whatever the boss said. But when they found one little zone for which they had a moral objection, it's like, oh, forget that. We'd never do tobacco. That would be bad. And my concern at the time was that meant that whatever there wasn't a red flag raised about, they would just do. Let's see how many ways we can split this fertilized egg into, who knows what thing they were thinking of. So the idea that a systematic arrangement has come into being where these questions, however messily, are addressed is exactly what we need to be doing. I wish there were institutional review boards for internet technology, or how about drone technology? Or how about, I don't know if you've seen on the internet, the extraordinary number of machines that are being invented that are essentially robot warriors. They can run upstairs now. They can, they're 8 feet high. They're 300 feet tall. We have plenty of movies that talk about where that goes. They have a mechanical dog who can run 40 miles an hour and not be tipped over. I'd like an institutional review board for how dangerous we want to make that dog. So I guess what I'm saying is that I'm very encouraged that we now have an analogy for what the implications of technology are, even at the early stage, for their impact on human beings. And I hope it can spread to other fields. I think that should be an area of study for this conference. What other fields need IRBs?